Hello and welcome to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association, an international professional organization of writers, photographers, and broadcasters focused on jazz. I'm Bob Blumenthal, JJA board member, and your host today for a discussion about research and writing about classic jazz styles in 2025. Joining me are Riccardi, Director of Research Collections at the Louis Armstrong Museum, and Fumi Tomita, Associate Professor of Jazz at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Since this podcast was recorded in January, Ricky has published his third volume on Armstrong, Stomp Off, Let's Go, and received the 2024 Grammy Award for Best Album Notes for his contribution to the King Oliver Collection Centennial. Fumi has received an honorable mention citation from the JJA Book Committee in the category Best History, Culture, and Criticism volume for his 2024 book, Early Jazz. Let me start the questioning, Ricky, with you. You've seen some shifts in how research is done, the real old school of how research was done.
My very first book was called What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. That was published in 2011. And that started off as my master's thesis. So I got a master's in jazz history and research from Rutgers, Newark. And that was Louis Porter's program. You know, we took classes on jazz historiography and how not to quite trust everything you read and how to do your own research. And of course, the Institute of Jazz Studies was right on campus. And our pal, the late, much missed Dan Morgenstern, was the director at the time. And so that was kind of my training ground. My master's thesis was 350 pages, and it was incomplete. It ended in 1961. Louis Porter had to almost physically stop me from writing, even though I still had 10 more years of the story. But my method was mostly to go to the Institute of Jazz Studies, photocopy everything I could find. They had a clippings file. They had every book you could dream of, every periodical you could dream of. If I couldn't find something, go down the hallway and ask Dan Morgenstern. And at the time, there were still 5 or 6 surviving members of Armstrong's band. There was his producer, George Avakian, his friend, Jack Bradley. And so that was really my method. Interview everybody I could find, photocopy whatever was out there, read whatever books I could deal with, talk to Dan Morgenstern and put out a book. And so that book came out in 2011, and I'm still very happy with it. And that was the only book I ever wanted to write, because I always felt like Armstrong's All-Stars period was kind of misunderstood and maligned. And I said, I'm going to come up with a new angle. So then flash forward, 6-7 years go by, and I get the itch to write another book. And I realized that most people were also sleeping on Armstrong's big band period. So I say, all right, that's going to be this. I'm going to work backwards now. I'm going to write this book, Heart Full of Rhythm. And the whole landscape had changed. I got an Ed Berger fellowship to the Institute of Jazz Studies, and I still went there and did some research in person. But all of a sudden, there was this whole new digital landscape where I barely had to leave my house. And so the big thing with that book was the black press. ProQuest had digitized the entire archives of the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American. And there was something with Armstrong's big band years, like even the late Terry Teachout, he said, oh, these years, Armstrong barely made a dent because he was only mentioned a handful of times in the New York Times, because that's usually where people start. In the black press, they followed Armstrong's every move, and they cheered him on when he was making these movies that kind of make us squirm now, or when he made these Decca records that people thought were kind of lightweight. And so that became the angle of that book. How is the black press covering Armstrong? And then that led me to get a subscription to newspapers.com, and just, how did the general press cover Armstrong? And the next thing you know, I find myself on archive.org, and they've got the entire Record Changer, and they've got other periodicals. And so that book felt like it was a different planet. I had more research. I had probably triple the research than I had for my first book. I don't think I had to interview anybody. I went to Dan Morgenstern, but for the most part, all the people I was writing with, they had all passed away, but they had left behind their oral history. So I went to Rutgers, I listened to those. But for the most part, I was home. And then just to bring it full circle, this last book, Stomp Off, Let's Go, the most recent book, this is Armstrong's early years. And for years, I resisted it because I said, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to rehash Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, and, tell the story of the Waif's Home and Fate Marable and what else is there? And it turns out there's so much out there. And the big thing for me, adding to the Black press and adding to newspapers.com, but this time I lived on ancestry.com and reading the police reports of when Armstrong was arrested and when his mother was arrested, and going through the Sword City directories and finding, the exact locations. And, Armstrong would mention a funeral of one of his friends who he went to school with. And now I'm able to find that friend's obituary and get a date for the funeral. And it really changed everything. I still did research at Tulane, but this book was probably the most heavily researched of all three. And I'd say 90% of it was done from the comfort of my own home.
Fumi, let me turn to you because your work, it almost is the title is a quote, if you will, on a previous work, Gunther Schuler's early jazz. Yet one of the things that really impressed me was while you cover the same artists in the same years, you've expanded the tent quite a bit to look at the ripple effects of these creators on more popular music styles that wouldn't necessarily be considered the real jazz, to scholars in previous decades. So I wonder if you could talk a little about revisiting these periods, and I don't know if correcting the historic record is the right term, or just revisiting and looking with new glasses.
Exactly, because when I was thinking about writing early jazz, I teach 3 jazz history classes at UMass Amherst. So jazz history is something I'm always thinking about. And I noticed with the early stuff that there's, it didn't seem to be as much research done as compared to other areas and stuff. And so I started investigating slowly. And actually I learned about it through traditional ways, like through some published books like Richard Sudhalter's book, Cord Cartney's book, and others, and articles that have been published in like academic quarterlies and periodicals and stuff like that. And it was nice to see the updated research, which is what I wanted to bring in. But I was curious of like how people thought of it, thought of early jazz in the 1950s or 1960s. Part of the reason I started getting interested in all this is because I started collecting records. And what really caught my eye was all of the different compilation records, like the history of classic jazz on Riverside. And it actually divides up early jazz in different periods, which I'd never seen before. And I thought, oh, wow, that's, and that sort of opened the doorway to finding, I think it was Samuel Charter's book on the New York jazz scene and all these different aspects that you don't see that often in a jazz history book. And then, of course, the names like Red Nichols or someone like that, who the casual jazz fan I don't think would know Red Nichols. And so, yeah, I became really interested in that and presenting the history. Correcting, I don't know if it's so much correcting, it's just so much presenting. Here's the music that happens, and maybe the reader can decide for themselves, like, is this jazz? Because it's interesting, because when Gunther Schuler wrote his book, I mean, that was in 1968. And I think he was talking to people who knew the music at that time. They knew what was popular. They knew all these people. But 50, 60 years later, a lot of those names have kind of disappeared a little bit. So I wanted to present that because there was all these different aspects, especially as I started digging more and more. I found all these fascinating stories about different musicians that I hadn't heard about. And musicians, too, that weren't necessarily like trailblazers like Louis Armstrong or Jelly Roll Morton or someone like that, but who were sort of trailblazers in their own way. I'm thinking of someone like Sam Wooding, who traveled around the world and stuff, and Arthur Briggs, people like that. And I found those stories equally as fascinating, so that it's not so much correcting, but sort of presenting what history, like what we present as history. And so you need to include the important people and the important names and songs, etc. But sometimes, and I guess this is where my jazz educator cap goes on, as you teach that to students, then they start to think that that's what you have to be, is you have to be like this great innovator. But there were so many musicians who did a lot of great stuff, but they didn't necessarily innovate in the way that changed the course of the music, but they did their own things. So that's a lot of the stuff I found absolutely fascinating. That's I did all the research.
I will admit, and many people think this is a guilty pleasure. One of my favorite jazz books is Robert Reisner's book, Bird, the Legend of Charlie Parker, where you
Okay.
get dozens of people trying to, create a historical record and giving you four different versions of an event. And
Oh
I
yeah.
always say that, particularly with the immortals, there's so much mythology created. As a researcher, you have to evaluate your sources. I wonder if each of you could speak to some of the challenges you have in doing that, particularly when it's a cold record and you can't sit there face to face with people.
Well, I'll speak on Armstrong because this latest book, Stomp Off, Let's Go, this felt like I felt like I was cracking a big detective case at times because Armstrong told a lot of the same stories for the last 40 years of his life, but occasionally the details would change or the dates would change. And then trying to do context clues and figure out, okay, what's the closest? Like my favorite example for, I'm saying 20, 30, 40 years, he was asked, when did you first play the cornet? And he always had the same answer without fail: in the waifs home, in the orphanage. I was 13 years old in the orphanage. Meanwhile, Henry Kid Renee, they're like, I remember Lewis playing before that. And Bunk Johnson, Sidney Bechet, I think he played before he went to Captain Jones's home. But Lewis, nope, first time orphanage. At the very end of his life, Lewis is in the hospital. He's in intensive care, and he grabs a pen and some paper and he wants to write the story about the Karnofsky family, the Jewish family that helped him out in New Orleans. And he writes that they helped him get his first cornet. But then he actually writes, a lot of people think I got my first cornet in the Wave Zone, but they're wrong. And I wanted to say, man, you've been telling him that for 40 years. So then I'm like, all right, well, where do I place this? Because elsewhere in that same manuscript, he mentions working for the Karnofskys. And then he's saying, but I wasn't playing yet. I wasn't playing cornet yet. And then I found a BBC interview where he's holding this Karnofsky manuscript in his hands, but he's still talking about learning how to play in the wave zone. So I couldn't figure it out. And then all of a sudden, going through the research of the late New Orleans jazz historian Tad Jones, he had a note from a conversation with George Finola, who was a curator at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, that Lewis got out of the Waifs home. He played a cornet given to him by Peter Davis, his first teacher. Armstrong returned this cornet to Davis when old man Karnofsky bought him a cornet, and the spelling was wrong and everything else was wrong about it. But I said, well, there it is. That was to me the smoking gun. And all of a sudden it made, then I found one more piece of the puzzle where Lewis met the actor James Caron, whose real name was James Karnofsky, and he remembered Lewis telling him that he was working on the junk wagon with the Karnofskys, and they found a beat up cornet in the garbage, and that was the first horn that Lewis just tried to play. And so then it's like, again, I'm presenting evidence here, but to me, it's like, all right, Lewis is working on the junk wagon. He finds an old beat up cornet. He teaches himself the rudiments. Kid Renee and Bunk Johnson and Sidney Bechet remember this little kid playing. He goes in the Waifs home. He gets formal lessons. He becomes the leader of the band. He leaves the Waifs home after a year and a half. Peter Davis gives him a cornet. He goes back, works for the Karnofsky family. 1915, that all lines up because he mentions the King Oliver personnel at Pete Lala's, and that matches up with Buddy Christian, what he told William Russell when they were researching Jasmine. So now we're in 1915, and Doc Sushan, he has this piece in the Record Changer about the pawn shop that sold Lewis the cornet in 1915. And then the last piece of the puzzle is that, this note from George Finola that old man Karnofsky bought Lewis a cornet. It happened in 1915. And so I present the evidence. I could be wrong. I could be wrong after all that. But to me, at times it was migraine inducing, but at the same time, it was really a lot of fun, because okay. Lewis just taking him at face value gets you so far, but trying to find other voices, other periodicals, other names, other dates, other places, just to try to add some context and get a little closer to the truth.
Well, but yeah, you had a method and the dedication to follow through on it. Fumi, any examples in your research?
It's very tough because there's some people, there wasn't like Sam Wooding, for example. Maybe we'll come back to him. I mean, there wasn't a lot of stuff on him. And so I had to rely on very few sources. And some of the sources, they're not, it seems to be like the one, I think some of them were from Storyville, the periodical down in New Orleans and stuff. And they had And it seemed to be interviews, but it's amazing. I mean, there's like photos, so that's actually a great periodical because they had a lot of great shots, and that seemed to be the only one of the few consistent sources of where scholars of early jazz would sort of come together. And so like there's photos of the musicians playing in India and stuff like that in 1927. So all this great stuff. So yeah, definitely, I mean, I had some hard times, deciphering. For example, when I was doing Fletcher Henderson, every history textbook talks about Copenhagen as being the track. And then I forget his last name, but he wrote the book on Fletcher Henderson. McGee, thank you very much. Thanks. And he made all these points about Copenhagen that it was like, basically it's from the sheet music. So there was all these things, and Court Carney also talks about that as well. And so, just going through all that, and it was actually Court Carney's book that led me to choose the remake of Dippermouth Blues. So as the Sugarfoot Stomp, that's the song. And a lot of stuff in my book, I kind of saw myself as the person who's deciphering which information to take, the best people who are talking about it, and then sort of it's sort of like a greatest hits, if you will, of different scholarly work and stuff like that. I definitely took a lot of pointers from other people and stuff like that. And going through their work, it's exhausting. Like Ricky said, it's a little like detective work. It's fun. This is what I do anyway. Even if I'm not right, I'm doing 2 writing projects. Doesn't matter. I'm still looking up other stuff, not because I'm a curious man, and I love this music, so I check it out. Like they say, go check it out. So I do.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think I can speak for all of us. We take on a writing project. We think we know something about the subject to begin with, okay, and have a view, an opinion, what have you. But as we go along, maybe we come up with some information we never had before. Maybe we listen to music again and form a different opinion of the music or the musician's place in the scheme of things. I just wonder if each of you might recall a discovery you made in doing your recent books.
I definitely found.
Yeah, you got it.
Because I made all kinds of, like, it was a real journey writing a book. And sort of like you start here and then like you end up, I didn't know I was going to be here. And one of those things for me was I learned how I never thought about it this way, but just how experimental early jazz was and how it was such an early time in the music's history, in music, like popular music history in general, actually. And so there was no like, there was, if like later on Benny Goodman, like he had his the new material with the sextet and the big band in the 30s and the 40s. But then after that, I noticed that he basically stuck to that formula and stuff like that. And so, but other musicians, but in the 20s, musicians didn't do that. There was no, like, you just change with the times. And so I realized that everybody, even Paul Whiteman, like changed their music. You listen to within a couple of years, it's just their music radically changes. And it's pretty amazing to think that, because it was a music that was, people were, it was, they're working it up as they went along, which is really great to listen to and stuff. So, and I had never, ever considered early jazz to be so experimental in that way. And I learned that. And I also learned too, that just how much free jazz actually gets from early jazz. And I had made the connection before, but it really hit home just how much a lot of the free jazz musicians, I'm talking about the ones from the 1960s specifically, and mostly the African-American musicians, especially Roland Kirk and Pharoah Sanders and people like that, like they really took ideas, and Henry Threadgill especially too, actually. They really borrowed ideas and concepts from early jazz that, anyway, it's interesting. It's kind of the things that maybe beboppers don't like about early jazz. So anyway, it was a real, I definitely, learned a lot. My whole conception of the music of early jazz and of jazz history had changed a lot.
Ricky.
Yeah, no, for me, you could say the whole process has been one of discovery, but there was always this kind of narrative clinging to Armstrong that early on he was this serious artist capable of making great art like Cornet Chop Suey and West End Blues. And then, he sold out, he went commercial. Next thing you know, he's got these Guy Lombardo saxophones, and, flash forward to Hello Dolly, and what a waste of a career. And the picture I'm trying to paint in the new book, which I never intended to write this trilogy backwards, but it's actually kind of worked out, where I started at the ending with the pop artist. Then the middle period was kind of him becoming the first black pop star. In this book, now I make my peace with West End blues and cornet chop suey, but I spend a lot of time hopefully trying to prove that Armstrong's values as a musician and as a performer were really kind of baked in his early days in New Orleans. Everything you see, showmanship, pop music, he goes on the river boats and they're listening, they're copying Art Hickman arrangements and Paul Whiteman arrangements. Lewis is playing slide whistle. Then he gets to the 20s, the King Oliver recordings. It's the high watermark of early New Orleans jazz. But even Oliver, he's got one foot out the door. He's looking to expand the band and add reeds and turn into a little more of a big band. And Armstrong, he goes from Henderson and then back to Carol Dickerson, and they're playing all the pop songs. He's with Erskine Tate. He's being featured on Cavalier Rusticana. He's doing routines with Zutty Singleton, where Zutty's basically wearing women's clothes. He's in drag, and this black theaters in Chicago, black audiences. And so all of that stuff is kind of like coming together. Then 1929, okay, switches him from the race record label to the pop label. And that's the moment all the jazz historians used to pull out their hair. But when you kind of go step by step, it's actually a natural progression. Armstrong was kind of, all these seeds were planted early on. And it was just like, well, this was the next logical step. As great as the Hot Five were, and as great as the recordings for Earl Hines were, those were studio groups. They were having their fun. And, even those weren't all, these beacons of fresh improvisation. Cornet Chop Suey, he wrote that solo down 2 years earlier and copyrighted it. And, Butter and Eggman was probably perfected, at the Sunset Cafe. So a lot of the things that he got kind of criticized for in the 50s and stuff, and people were saying, if only he was, the pure artist he was in the 20s, he was doing all that stuff in the 20s. He was repeating solos and doing pop tunes and doing comedy. And so after writing 3 books on the man, I think there's an incredible consistency to his career that's might not be readily apparent. When you look at West End Blues on one end and What a Wonderful World on the other, you go, these are 2 different guys. When you really kind of dive in, it's like, oh no, wait a minute. This was one guy the whole time.
Well, if I can add, I don't know if discovery is a word, but it really hit home when I wrote a brief history of jazz for a series of books the Smithsonian was doing about, it's a music that was expanding as technology was expanding, and technology allowed it to expand. Fumi, when you talk about the way they're picking up on influences in the 20s, there are 78 records and there are soon radio remote broadcasts. And as the music develops and the technology allows for more than 3-minute performance documentation and live recording and all kinds of expansive approaches when video can be added and what have you, that this really has had an influence on the development of the music. And that was my epiphany, I guess you'd say. I got a notice today, apropos what I had been thinking about the Henry Grimes archive at the New York Public Library. And I thought, wow, there must be so many hidden resources that are out there. And I wonder if there are go-to places for new researchers to go to find out the variety of archives of this type.
Well, I'll volunteer my little starter pack here. So some of this stuff you have to pay for, but like I said, I pay for a newspapers.com subscription. I pay for an ancestry.com subscription. Use them. My book's done. It's published, but I still use them every week because, like Fumi said, I'm curious. I'll hear a song, hear about a concert from the 30s or whatever. So those 2 I kind of live on. Then there's RIPM, Jazz Periodicals. RIPM was a project spearheaded by the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers, where they digitized every jazz periodical, made it fully searchable. And at first, you needed to be affiliated with an institution, Juilliard or something like that. And then last year or the year before, they opened it up to individual subscriptions, $200 a year, every downbeat and every jazz times, and then every metronome and hot club bulletins in the 30s and the jazz review in the 50s, the record changer. Art Hody's magazines, Jazz Record, you name it. It's all there and it's fully searchable. So again, those three things. And then there are free resources. The Institute of Jazz Studies, they've put up about 100 of the jazz oral history projects going back from the 70s, and they're all on the Institute of Jazz Studies website. You just need to create an account, but you can listen to 5 hours of Kenny Clark and Roy Eldridge and Zutty Singleton, and so many are on that website. Tulane, they digitized all of their early jazz oral histories, and I'm sure Fumi became very well acquainted. Yeah, I mean, I lived with
I
these.
did.
I mean, they're magical because the first generation and Bill Russell and Dick Allen got to sit down with these guys starting in the late 50s and get their stories. And I think I quote them on every page, and that's all free. Tulane has a website called Music Rising where you can listen to all of those oral histories. Keep checking the Vanderbilt Digital Archives because they acquired the late Phil Schapp's collection and they're starting to upload it. But I can tell you, because I worked with people who worked on the collection, that Phil saved every interview he did on WKCR from 1972 until the end. And they're all going to eventually, that was Phil's wish before he passed. He made the deal with Vanderbilt that they would all live for free on their website. And so they're starting to come up there. But I've heard a bunch, and I quote a bunch in the book. You know, we're talking Louis Metcalf and Clyde Bernhardt, and he had Bix Beiderbecke festivals. He had Roy Eldridge on about a dozen times, and Max Roach, Dizzy Gillespie. And I do think when people have access to that, that's going to change jazz scholarship. And so everything I'm mentioning, and last but not least, is archive.org. Archive.org has also digitized so many books that I was not able to find in libraries. And again, a free account. You can quote unquote borrow the book right on your computer. You can do a full text search if you're looking for a certain artist or a certain story. And you know, you can literally search for song titles, copyright deposits, you name it. That's all for free as well. So that's pretty much how I did this last book. And just to get my plug out of the way, the Louis Armstrong House Museum, we've digitized our archives. We received a $2.7 million grant to do that. And so anybody interested in Armstrong can go to louisarmstronghouse.org and you can literally listen to every tape Louis Armstrong made and go through his scrapbooks and his collages and all that kind of stuff, all for free. You just have to create an account. So that's my quick whirlwind tour through this wonderful digital world of jazz research.
Fumi, anything to add to that?
Wow. Well, I'd like to add plus, so many of those are plus ones. Archive.org is something I discovered not too long ago and stuff. Oh my God, it's just tons of stuff, and all the downbeats, billboards, and stuff like that. Some of the stuff that Ricky just mentioned, those are all great. Those are awesome place. Newspapers.com. It's all great stuff. I found some other resources you can use through libraries, the dissertations and theses. Sometimes it's interesting because there's a lot of very good work there that hasn't been published and stuff. So maybe students did it for their degree, but didn't want to pursue the career path in research. So they never did anything with it. And so I found a lot of great stuff. Actually, I found an unbelievable dissertation on the history of jazz drums that this guy, Denny Brown, wrote. And he actually taught at UMass, and he retired not too long before I got there. And he wrote like 700 pages. Oh my God. And it was like detailed on Tony Barbero and like all these Gene Krupa. Like it was unbelievable. I'd never seen anything like it. It was a real work from the heart and stuff like that. So anyway, there's lots of great sources there. Yeah, there's, it's actually a lot of stuff because the internet has made it very easy to not leave your house. And, my library will digitize stuff. I can just request it. They'll, in fact, I used to go to the library just to browse through the downbeats, and now they don't have them anymore. So I have to request the article specifically, and they'll send me a PDF and all this and that. But I was going to mention there's a lot of places that have the Vermont Jazz Center north of me. They have an archive of concerts and stuff like that and all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of those types of places, like the Louis Armstrong Museum. So lots of nonprofits and stuff, releasing all of their material. And so I think we're going to, there's a lot of possibility for research in jazz. And anybody who's interested, as what I found, there's a lot to be done if somebody wants to do it.
Great transition to my final question, which is, and I don't mean for your next projects, but what do you feel is the next classic jazz topic that deserves new glasses, if you will. If you had to advise someone, this is the book we really need on the artist or the style or the instrument or what have you, does anything come to mind quickly?
This might be too broad, but it's funny. Fumi mentioned Gunther Schuller, and some have argued that I've kind of made my career refuting Gunther Schuller. Everything Schiller wrote about Armstrong. I said, well, I don't agree with that, so I'm going to write 3 books and show him where he was wrong. Schiller's swing era is kind of a seminal text, but at the same time, all Schiller did was listen to the records and the studio recordings and make his own opinions. And that is it. Gunther Schuller has spoken. Here's what I feel about the swing era. And that was the 1987, 88. Now, so much material musically has come out. Jam sessions, Savory, the Savory collection, which is on Mosaic and stuff. And now, like I said, with the Jazz Oral History Project, with Phil Schaap's interviews, I think a lot of those musicians who have not been heard from, who have not been quoted, people just go to Schiller or they go to Leonard Feather and all that stuff. I feel like the music is filling in holes, and then I feel like the voices are going to fill in holes. And I feel like there's like an alternate history of the swing era, which would be a perfect companion to, I don't need to give you more work, Fumi, but you've already expanded early jazz, because again, so much jazz history begins in 1945 with Bop. And so, Fumi's done the job in, I think, shining the light on the early jazz, but I feel like the 1930s and the early 40s, we now have more music and we have more sources and more interviews. And I feel like something really fresh can be done with that era.
It's funny you mentioned, I guess if you write early jazz, it's like, what's next? I mean, that was sort of my vision when I started the project. I've got other stuff in the queue and I'm preparing myself for the swing era. It's been challenging because there's a lot of new stuff. And also I realized that I don't really know some of the society bands that were out there. And it's not like something people need to know, but it definitely, it's interesting because sometimes jazz, just the word jazz is so confusing because it encompasses so much music. And some of these big bands, I can't remember off the top of my head the names. I was listening to some Hal McIntyre, I think is one, and Shep Fields maybe, and kind of maybe more on the sort of the pop side of things. They happen to be a big band, but definitely there's all this stuff there. And some people have published a few things here and there, but it's very wide, and I definitely don't see it as one book. It seems like it could be like even just an overview. It seems to be like several volumes actually to really do it justice. I saw that Tad's book actually was about a small group. Was it Jazz on the Beat?
Tad Richards, who unfortunately was unable to join us. Jazz with the Beat, small group swing, 1940 to 1960, that puts people like Illinois Jacquet, Louis Jordan, Johnny Otis, Bartholomew, Bill Doggett, Ray Charles, Jimmy Smith as a focal point in development of jazz style in that period.
I was actually surprised he mentioned a lot of what a lot of people consider R&B artists and stuff, but I was just thinking there's a generation of musicians who grew up with swing. They have the swing sound, but they have maybe the bebop language. They have the sound of the swing. Oscar Pettiford on bass. There's a lot of players. Sweets Edison, I guess, would be another, and stuff like, maybe not too firmly into. They sort of fit into that swing to bop era and stuff like that. I know Ira Gittler wrote a book on that stuff.
I'd love to see a book on the history of the piano trio.
Oh,
yeah. Developed from its first incarnation when it basically was piano, bass, and guitar, and where it's gone from there with electronic instruments and different international musical styles mixed in. It's a fascinating evolution, and I'd love to see a book that was focused on that subject. Anyway, I've really enjoyed our session. Thank you, Ricky Riccardi and Fumi Tomita, for what's been a fascinating session. For more from the Jazz Journalists Association, go to jjanews.org. I'm Bob Blumenthal. Thanks for listening.